Hello, Paul, Bhargav, and Raga. I just wanted to get your insights on a topic our analytical team have been looking at as part of our various reviews of the region, which is the evident rise in China's stature and America's declining role. Paul, it would be interesting to know your thoughts about this for the team. And do you mind if I record this call for internal distribution?
Look, you can probably have Bhargav have a listen to it. There's probably no reason we can't send it out publicly as well. But reserve your judgment until Bhargav reviews it. Look, I mean, I don't think the American has declined in the region. I think globally, despite what it thinks it's declining as in its position as a hegemonic power, it's doing all it can to remain in a position of hegemonic power. But I think there's significant changes that are going to, or that are already evidencing that their position is in decline. They withdrew from the region when they went trigger happy in Iraq and then Afghanistan. That enabled China to rise and position itself not only in Asia Pacific, but within the Belt and Road Initiative, but also got its tentacles right out to the Pacific Islands, particularly through Southeast Asia, and of course, their expansion in the South China Sea. So I don't think it's correct to say America's declining power in the region. I think it's doing everything it can to get back in here. Agreements with Japan, building bases in the Philippines, putting more bases in Northern Australia. I think the critical issue to consider is, in its desire for hegemonic power, we have to look at the geopolitical issue, the main geopolitical issues. One is China's continuing to expand. If we look at the GDP figures, in nominal terms, America's not much bigger than China. In purchasing parity power basis, it's significantly in China's favour. We're talking significantly larger, 20% larger at about $30 trillion, which is, $5 trillion or 20% bigger than America based on US figures. I think that also masks China's power, because if you look at the GDP per capita, China's still a middle income country, and of course that's based just on its massive population, second biggest population on the world, 1.4 billion, of course, after the ever-growing India, which doesn't match China in terms of organisational skills. Bhargav, I might just get you to throw in your two bobs worth there, because if we look at America's position in World War II and how it came out of that, how it was able to consolidate power, and other key factors like how it spread its nuclear warheads throughout Europe and its manipulation of Ukraine to go into war on the basis of peace. But before I potentially divert there, Bhargav, why don't you give us your thoughts?
Certainly, Paul. Paul, I will use your point about India's organizational power as a segue. It is undeniable that the stature of Chinese stature has been on the rise, and that's primarily because of their ability to hold on to power and monopolize violence internally, which basically means there isn't a chaos within the country. Thus, they can focus on what's actually important, that is growing the economy, focusing on the foreign policy, effective foreign policy, I might add, which India lacks tremendously. In fact, because of quote-unquote democracy, there are quite a few divergent interests which are pulling the country apart in so many different ways, and the recent one being the right-wing Hindu nationalism. Having said that, when we look at a regional as well as at the global scale, there is no question about China being the primary competitor to the US, and India doesn't come close, despite its ambition to project itself as quote-unquote Vishwaguru. That basically means world's teacher, but unfortunately it is not able to punch above its weight. In fact, it has always been punching below its weight, and it's only a regional power within South India or Indian Ocean region. So having said that, the American advantage here clearly is the hard power which it possesses after it decimated the Axis side in the World War, and they have been able to build on it despite competing with the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But
can I just interject there, okay? Because I think we have to not, and I think a massive problem is that America believes in its own exceptionalism, and it believes it won the World War II. It was the main beneficiary from World War II, but I don't think we should basically forget some real statistics. And the Soviet Union lost roughly 24 million people in the war and roughly 10 million soldiers. The United States lost 400,000 odd soldiers, maybe 415,000 from memory. We must also remember that while the Soviet Union and the Allies were fighting the Germans and the Japanese, the United States had let its military go to rack and ruin, and it had to build its military force. At the end of the war, most of those large countries were decimated by war. Now, I'm not taken away from the fact that the US did an incredible job at the end. Their industrial might was critical. Their ability to crank up production of military weapons, uniforms, trained soldiers, incredible. But let's not think they were the only ones fighting. Your own country, India, had massive losses. The Allies had massive losses. Small countries nearly lost, much more of their fighting age population were lost. Countries were decimated, and you're kind of falling into the propaganda, which is the American exceptionalism, and basically, they've got that belief that they are the only superpower. They have better values, better economies, and I think they're starting to believe their own Gatorade to the point that, Putin's a horrible man with three horns, like Hitler. Everything in America is good, but it's kind of like Scott Ritter getting banned on YouTube and having to move to Rumble because he actually talks about rational ideas that are propaganda that are coming out of the media tracks of the US. So sorry to pull you up on that, but I think there's a lot bigger argument for America's belligerent attitude, its involvement in so many wars, it's getting people into support IMF, World Bank, UN, and then criticising China for Belt and Road initiatives. So back to you, but let's not overplay America's involvement in being the sole power that won World War II. That nothing is further from the truth.
Absolutely, Paul. Those points are very well noted and very important to note. As we talk about American interventionism and their own delusion of exceptional position what they have in the world, and we can't really forget the speech what Obama gave at the beginning of the so-called intervention what they made in Syria, or which rather it didn't go to their liking in 2012. Paul, would you say the American sphere of influence is receding progressively with the rise of China in stature, especially in the Pacific and more so in Africa and the Middle East?
I think there's two things. I think there's their ability to project themselves, and then there's the relative power. And if we look at the history, there's, America basically used post-Cold War tensions to spread nuclear weapons into Germany, Italy, France, Turkey, Netherlands, Greece, Belgium, and then of course France and the UK developed their own nuclear capability. But right now there's 5 member states that hold US nuclear arsenals: Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, I think it's Turkey. And I think that fact that America thinks it can hide behind nuclear power is something that 30, 40 years ago was pretty cool when the Soviet Union was so powerful and challenging. I think we have to look at America's relative power. And if we look at its belief that it could go into Iraq and Afghanistan, Afghanistan proved it cannot win wars on the ground. It has a belief that it can win wars in the air, and it's proven to be that no one can do that if you don't have infantry on the ground. You're kidding yourselves. But it's politically acceptable for the pundits in Langley and Capitol Hill to convince themselves that they don't actually need to put infantry on the ground. They certainly, America has some of the greatest special forces to ever walk the earth, but without infantry to back up special force operations, you're not going to capture a whole ground. So it's a cop-out, and using air forces is an incredibly expensive cop-out. Now, if we look at America's belief that it can go and fight China next to the Chinese mainland for Taiwan, if you can't go and sort issues out in Afghanistan and you're going to go to the next superpower and fight a war across the Pacific Ocean against China, then I think there's a difference between not fully understanding your relative power and not understanding basic challenges to fight wars and maintain logistic bases on the other side of the world, but doing so against a superpower looking to test its capability. I think it's just delusional. It's sad to see that a once great superpower that was incredibly well led is now just a bunch of agencies, both security agencies and other international agencies, hiding behind words like united and international and world, but they've become complicit suits beckoning to the powers to be, and the powers to be aren't really being realistic. If we look at Russia's expansionism into various states in the African continent, if we look at China's expansion through the Belt and Road Initiative, the challenging of power of the US and its allies in the Pacific Islands, I think America is desperate, and I think they've played a massive hand in the Russian invasion into Ukraine, which they're dumping on Russia. If you look at the history, it tells a different story on how Kiev had a regime change and who was playing a hand in that. Zelensky saying he's going to run on a platform as a comedian to be the leader of the country, and he's going to bring about peace in America and resolve the issue. Peace with Russia and bring about peace in the east of Ukraine. NATO being used not as an instrument of peace, but as a catalyst to war. And the massive defence expenditures that US is committing to ultimately is weakening themselves economically. So it's indisputable that America is the hegemonic power currently because of its hard power, but its soft skills are so poor. It's leading to a change of loyalties and a general distrust by many nations towards America. And that's going to affect America's ability to get the resources it needs and to have the relationships it needs to maintain power. Meanwhile, countries are starting to trade across borders without going through the US currency protocols. And of course, we're also seeing China and Russia prove that they're not an easy pushover. Russia's proving that now in the Ukraine. NATO's sitting back. They've got civil unrest, particularly in France, but in other nations as well, because these wars are not seeing American soldiers in body bags. It's clearly Ukraine, but all those other countries in Europe know how close this is to home and how much the combination of the logistical effects on the massive impacts on the supply chain, firstly because of COVID and now because of the war, is just starting to be very evident that America's belief in its own power and its own morals and ethics are no longer being followed and believed by a lot of other countries. And we see that, of course, in the growth of BRICS, Bhargav.
Paul, it's interesting that you mentioned about the nuclear arsenal being maintained in 5 other countries. I can't help but highlight the level of hypocrisy which goes into such policy making, especially when they do this drama at the global stage of preventing Iran from attaining nuclear power for civilian use. I'm not questioning, or I'm not making a saint out of Iran's ruling regime, the Ayatollah, led by the Ayatollah, but that underlines the level of hypocrisy what we see in terms of nuclear proliferation. But at the same time, Paul, it would be interesting to get your thoughts on one critical contentious topic, that is responsibility to protect. And apparently that seems to be behind two of the major components which underlines America's position at the global stage. That is being belligerent, using a moral ego trip, and being and the interventions what they have led in various sectors, including Libya, Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
Yeah, look, I mean, Bhargav, it's a really interesting point. I wouldn't call it hypocrisy. I think to have hypocrisy, you have to make conscious decisions. I think the fact that YouTube and the American government obviously has banned Scott Ritter, who's one of the few guys that's rationally trying to educate the American public that the Western media is hoodwinking them, and that people that are supposed to be leading the country is leading the world to down the path of World War III. Many American respected academics and think tanks believe they've already led us into World War III. But if you look at this concept of hypocrisy, needs a conscious thought. I think it's arrogance. I think, the enormous defence budgets and resource allocations have allowed US to interfere in domestic affairs of numerous developing countries. A few examples include the bombing of Serbia in 1999, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the Iraq invasion in 2003, the bombing of Libya in 2011. Meanwhile, the Pentagon's failed 5 consecutive audits in a row and couldn't account for 61% of its assets during the last audit in November 2022. So when a country has military intel strategic group in Langley, and when you have Capitol Hill believing in their own Gatorade, and when you have them actually creating such massive expenditure budgets, US spent $187 billion on national defence in 2022. That's greater than the next 9 countries in the world combined in that year. But this isn't hypocrisy, mate. This is arrogance. And large swathes of America are largely apathetic and not concerned with these issues because they've had a history of such a successful capitalistic democratic country that they believe the system's always doing right for the world and right for themselves. And frankly, the world needs them to do that, but it's stopped doing it. So people now are more apt to look at China and look at Russia and look at the growth of BRICS and accept that perhaps America's self-appointment as the global ombudsman isn't something that they feel gives them a warm and fuzzy. And so that exceptionalism, which has etched into American politics since their independence, is something that's now getting them into trouble because they have a self-belief that was once confident and righteous. Now it's become arrogant, myopic, and self-serving. And that's not a comment I'm directing at American people. That's something I'm directing at the American leadership, mainly the public service, because they're the ones that stay in changes of government. But I'm also throwing in my country the Five Eyes AUKUS and all these, little hands darting across and moving big hands on very small maps. And it's a grave concern that the American, what you call hypocrisy, what I call arrogance, is ultimately just leading to a much more unsafe world whilst pointing fingers at Russia and China for everything being unsafe, Bhargav.
Well, it's very hard to disagree with that. But at the same time, that leads me to question if the American imperialist empire, which has stood since 1945, is it collapsing under its own weight like we saw with Rome?
Well, look, I mean, you can compare America's growth and its potential decline to, you know, to the Roman Empire and of course the British Empire. I think, however, the decline of the American nation it's at least 2 decades away in my belief. I think there's a strong argument that what's going on in Europe is designed to bring about instability in economies, which means there's a flood of money. And if you really want to analyse, don't look at the words of the Western media or any media, but look at the flow of data and the flow of money. And there's been a massive capital flow back to America, which helps stitch up, you know, capital supplies, and it helps the American economy, and it helps the fact to hide the absurd debt levels that America has. But I think the shift of nations that are now trading across the borders in various currencies, Chinese currency, Russian currencies, to name a couple, is one factor that's ultimately going to take away America's ability to maintain primacy of economic strength that enables them, in their mind, to maintain their righteous position as the global leader. And of course, others will see that as an out-of-place bully. But there's other factors, okay? Your country of India, for example, Modi, you can say what you like about Modi and the very dangerous path of, you know, nationalistic, pro-Hindu, anti-everyone else. But he's like, in the West and indeed China and Russia, the media is controlled. Modi controls it. He controls the messaging. The messaging goes out. The Western world laps it up and sends it out. China, Russia does the same thing. Bing, bing, big surprise. America and the Allies do the same thing. For me, it's horrendously scary when any country loses objective media. It loses people's ability to see their foe or their opposition for what they are. Instead, they build up a picture that isn't true about their foe, and thus they don't grow and develop in a manner to compete against that foe or that opposition. I think America's just its military might and its right to think it's right, and its political system, and that's not a compliment, but the fact that there isn't really a free process. There's two opposing political parties, and they are kind of merging in the middle to seek popularity. Whoever's in it doesn't change their approach much. They continue to be over-fulfilled in their own role in the world and over-fulfilled in their right to play the power to be. But I think America's decline is only partly in their hands. I think their decline is going to be more about China's rise and surpassing them. Of course, there's factors that could mean China could implode. Their political system has one leader for life. It used to have a more democratic system of changing leaders, but that's changed. And I think Raga's probably better off at talking about that than myself, Bhargav.
Thank you, Paul. I think that makes a very valid point here, that is about the party system in the US, where it's always between the two parties and nothing much changes there. I must agree there. Raga, if I may ask you to comment on the leadership component of China's rise. Deng Xiaoping led from the front and opened up China's economy in the late 80s. Would you say, and would you attribute China's strength to its leadership?
Yes, Bhargav, that's a really good question. And the answer is affirmative, because Deng Xiaoping was and is considered as one of the pioneers of modern China today. From Mao's China, where we saw incredible levels of poverty, Deng Xiaoping comes in with a plan, a strategy for the next 25 years, for the next 50 years in place, they bring in market liberalization policies, which is called often as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And in that vein, they brought in more of free market policies, but limited to the Chinese governance structures, so that they still exercise some level of control. So this was one of the biggest changes that we saw in the 80s. And interestingly, if we have to just bring in an example of India and China, both of them were similarly placed GDP-wise about the 1970s or to the 1980s. And the kind of rise we've seen from China is absolutely unparalleled. So just imagine that a country of a similar size, similar people, similar poverty levels just rose into becoming one of the future superpowers. So that's the level of rise that we've seen in China, thanks to the incredible leadership of Deng Xiaoping.
Raga, in the same vein, would you say China's entry into WTO is one of their weaknesses? And if not, what do you think is their primary weakness? Paul, could you comment on the same as well?
Yeah, you go first, Raga.
Sure, Paul. And Bhargav, on your question, I think China's entry into the WTO was calculated for a long time. There was a lot of controversy over it, but eventually, China also realized that the way the rules are set in the international liberal order is in a way that it's gamed or rigged in favor of the Western nations. So part of their plan is to establish an alternative world order, where we're seeing with the BRICS and other multilateral institutions coming up. But also the other side is to kind of infiltrate some of these Western-dominated institutions that we're seeing, and kind of buy more, influence and power, so that some of the nations who've been traditionally allies of the West are also slowly moving in favor to China. So, moving into the WTO is a calculated move, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I agree, Raga. I think it's a very calculated move. I think it's one that they had to do. They had to grow their economy. They needed to import and export. They needed to kill off tariffs. They needed to become part of the global economy. I think the real change, Bhargav, is how much more mature China has become in diplomacy, how it's building, bilateral successes, how it's setting up international organizations such as the Asian Infrastructural Development Bank. I think China's challenge is always going to be the one challenge, and that itself, its ability to control elements of society where there's unrest because they're a different culture, and also their ability to maintain the party and maintain leadership with the challenges of the number of people they have when they hit hard economic times. I think the West is starting to hang their hat on such things and think the way America thinks it has exceptionalism and a system of superiority. I think they're also extremely ill-guided in thinking that China's system's so weak it will inevitably fold. I think China's problems of its human rights issues, dealing with its own minorities in a way that's not going to incite violence, an ability to overcome their aging population, maintain the city versus rural living standards, and not marginalise society to a point where it goes down a massive upheaval internally in terms of unrest. I think that's its challenges. I think China's got to change its business integrity and ethics. It wants to go and do work externally and tries to steal networks, steal intellectual property, doesn't understand that to do business successfully internationally, where there's lots of partners and lots of capital involved, you can't look for a win-win situation in that you win twice. You actually have to have a win-win for your partners as well. And their inability to respect other people, to have values where they can see other people's cultures and manners is going to be a real challenge in terms of not trying to exploit every commercial situation to steal intellectual property, steal networks, steal clients, steal supply chain opportunities is something that is a massive challenge to the Chinese government. But in summary, I think their problems are more internal than external, Bhargav.
Well, like we spoke about the sphere of influence, American sphere of influence, how would you look at the Belt and Road initiative? She was very optimistic about it. They expected a lot from it, especially the countries which were looking up to the Chinese market. But if we look at 3 or 4 case studies, the initiative has been more of a bane than a boon. The best example I can give right now is Pakistan, then Sri Lanka, and Eastern Africa. Pakistan is still struggling with the foreign exchange reserves. Sri Lanka is still struggling to post a positive growth rate. They're still projecting minus 3.5 or minus 2. And in Eastern Africa, there are quite a few complaints about the nature and the quality of work being done in terms of infrastructure by Chinese companies with, flailing road and poor quality of metro systems. How would you look at it, Paul?
Oh, look, I think firstly, I think you've got to consider all those countries and all those sub-regions you're talking about are way beyond, I mean, their problems are way beyond China and the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, I think you've forgotten to think critically about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and this magical thing the World Bank has is we're fighting world poverty. Well, don't seem to be doing too well at that after several decades. Those countries, their economies, their political situations are pear-shaped to begin with. I think the Chinese leadership will be disappointed with the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, from a purely strategic standpoint, they tried too much, too quickly, spread themselves too far. It was always going to be an underperforming strategic initiative. I think also there's a bit of a cunning plan there to gain strategic assets and fund infrastructure and have countries indebted for ultimately long-term political leverage, access to resources and access to strategic ports and ability to expand their projection of logistics via rail, road and through ports. So I think we need to look at that Belt and Road Initiative for what it is, and that is an overly optimistic, under-resourced piece of naivety by the Chinese government, but I don't think it's without disadvantage to them. But I think we need to keep it in perspective that the World Bank, IMF and UN, other than reports they commission, no one sees them as efficient organisations. So I think we need to be rational in terms of being overly judgment on the Belt and Road Initiative, because there's a lot more failures to quote on those international organisations that talk about that paint themselves as the rosiest saviour of the globe. They've had a lot longer to fix mistakes, but all they've done is really splash money and gloat and ask for more money. So keep it balanced, mate, when we're being critical of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Paul, that's fair enough. In the same vein, I must make an observation here. Of course, I'll get you to comment on it and maybe close off this round with comments from Raga and yourself. When we look at some of these troubled economies, including Sri Lanka and Pakistan, you can observe that the moment the trouble starts, Chinese tend to get apprehensive and withdraw themselves, while when we compare India's influence in the region, India tends to be a lot more generous and is far more optimistic in terms of helping these economic troubles in Sri Lanka, especially. India's contribution during the financial crisis last year was close to $6 billion. So could either of you comment on it, and maybe we can have closing comments as well?
Yeah, I think, Raga, you go for it.
So, Bhargav, I think one of the things we need to remember when we're comparing India and China's involvement in Sri Lanka is India has a vested interest to be in the good books of Sri Lanka, especially after the LTTE war, especially after it's lost the will and confidence of the Sinhalese people, because it did intervene and meddle with their affairs. So perhaps, some of the times where the Indian government is making those moves, rather than just having an optimistic view of the Sri Lankan economy, it's also to kind of patch up sour relations, I would say, within the subcontinent and extend their sphere of influence, where China has been dominating for some time. So I think it's fair to say that, India does operate with an agenda, and it's not just doing it out of maybe, charity or out of goodwill, I would say. And looking at some of these economies itself, Bhargav, they have been troubled for a very long time. So I do agree with Paul in the sense that a lot of these countries have had issues in the past, and it's not like the World Bank and the other international organizations have not had other issues with their own projects, right? And of course, there will be occurrences where you have an overambitious project laid out, and there will be instances of failures. So I don't know if that necessarily speaks to the Belt and Road Initiative itself, but it has built a lot of partners across the world. I think it's about over 100 countries which have collaborated with China over this massive infrastructure project. And if you look at the public sentiment within a lot of African countries, Myanmar, Pakistan, they have turned largely favorable towards China, as opposed to the US involvement too. So I would say that there are some pointers to be taken from this.
Yeah, and I might just add in closing, Bhargav, we've got to look at the reality behind some of these broader strategic viewpoints. The US's share of global GDP has declined roughly from 30% down to about 22 or 23%. And we're seeing these global trade wars. Yeah, but we're seeing bans on large companies like Huawei, ZTE technology. How much of that's real and how much of it's political manoeuvring by the US and its allies? Okay, now that's another hour's debate on its own, but it's also cost US suppliers $11 billion annually. Caught up in it has been US allies. Australia has been particularly hit hard by payback bans by the Chinese. Ultimately, though, it's very easy for America to say we're banning Huawei because they could insert, spyware in our telecommunication system. Yeah, they could, but show the proof that they have. And also, surely, in the current world's level of technology, you'd be able to have systems to actively identify it and call it out. So I think we've really got to maintain our ability to think critically and be balanced in our thinking, because there is no doubt about it. The only people that don't think America is losing relative power in the global stage is people sitting in Washington, D.C., particularly in Langley, and particularly in Capitol Hill. Everybody else in the world can clearly see if you've dropped share of GDP from 31 to 23%, if China is 20% bigger than you on a PPP GDP basis, if two countries between them in India and China have 2.8 billion people, and if you have massive civil unrest and in your own country date of allowing people to carry assault weapons, and then you point at China and other countries for not being well run, that what you call hypocrisy, what I call exceptionalism converted to arrogance with time, I think there's no other way to look at it than America right now, maybe 2 or 3 more decades, date of hardware and date of an overconfidence and date of muscle memory in terms of some of the international organisations and lending zones, and it's the fact that it's worked out ways to control and manipulate the international banking sector will maintain hegemonic power. But it's slipping, it's slipped, number 2 is gaining, and there are many factors. We discussed some of them today. The growth of BRICS, the desire to no longer follow these international organisations, looking for alternatives on how companies trade across borders. We're seeing a major shift. And that's going to affect, and getting back to Babel's opening, everything our analytical team does, we have a process. What's the objective? Who's the audience? And so what? What are the major factors that are going to impact the world and our clients? And that process is going to be driven by these geopolitical issues, because I only really now watch the Western media for entertainment value. There's very little open, honest, analytical processes going on. It's just a constant bombardment of pretty people in wonderful suits standing in a pulpit giving opinion. It's not backed up by any fact. And then on any particular issue, the death of Goguen today will be an example. They get 4 or 5 academics, they waffle some opinion, and then the whole Western world and the media run down a path like that comedy Team America. The problem is Team America was meant to be a comedy movie. It's become like an SOP manual to point out the folly. So let's close it off now, Bhargav, because it's gone a little bit over, and then circulate it amongst the team and decide if this is relevant or useful to send out publicly, okay?
Thank you, Paul. Those were very interesting and important points and a very stimulating discussion indeed. Thank you, Raga and Bassel as well. Thank you.